So I suppose what drew me to working at the Forum was, as a social worker, I've worked in many different contexts: local government, state government, lots of not-for-profits, in academia as well. And I thought the Forum was a really great place to take leadership. I mean, as a representative of communities and community organisations, the Forum is a lead player and can influence the practice of community and social services with people across Greater Western Sydney. So what drew me to working at the Forum as a social worker, after working in many different contexts and organisations such as local government, state government, academia, other not-for-profits, I saw Western Sydney Community Forum as an opportunity to be a leader of communities and community organisations and look at leadership in the way we work in social and community services with organisations and how we work with people on the ground.
Yeah.
I stuffed that up.
What was how long ago did you start here?
I started in May 2019 part-time, just before the December 2019 COVID pandemic hit.
And how did that affect you?
It impacted, I guess, globally and locally. How it affected me was not being able to give to the workplace because of care for children and having to homeschool children when we didn't know what was going on. And I suppose the impact was kind of being at a standstill and working in a very reactive way, rather than being able to do what I wanted to do and wanted to achieve here at the Forum. It was in 2021, I believe, in between COVID lockdowns, I think. Look, I can't remember. The COVID lockdown, pandemic associated lockdowns has kind of blurred time in a sense for me. So it was either 2020 or 2021. I remember we had a meeting in March 2021, and that might have been our first meeting on the International Day. No, it was May. It was National Sorry Day. So in terms of the Working Party, so we did have a face-to-face meeting and then felt a lot of disruption due to COVID waves coming, and our focus was to protect all members of the Working Party, but in particular Aboriginal elders Uncle Greg and Auntie Carol. So they were not confident in using online mechanisms to have meetings. So we made a decision to pause meetings and focus on work that could be done by staff rather than having meetings themselves. So as part of the work and during that break time in meetings for COVID, one of the opportunities that arose in terms of anti-racism was the release of a consultation paper by the Australian Human Rights Commission, which was about a proposed national anti-racism framework. So this would be about, bringing anti-racism into the national conversation and saying as a nation we support anti-racism and we, want to dismantle racism, so to speak. So what we did was we put in a policy submission into that consultation, and we made a number of recommendations, which was about centering our First Nations, in any anti-racism framework. It was about looking at the media and media portrayals, and a whole host of other recommendations. But essentially we said we were in support of a national anti-racism framework. Since our submission, we have had many conversations with the Australian Human Rights Commission, as they recognise Western Sydney to be one of the most diverse communities in Australia. So we've continued that conversation with them, and some of the feedback they've given us, because when they rattled off, oh, we're thinking through and thinking of these themes, one of the things that the officer said to us was, because I said, oh, you know, that sounds really similar to the themes that we recommended and put forward in our submission. And the officer said, oh, yes, that was my favourite submission. So it really validated our involvement in these conversations. So being able to make an impact in Western Sydney, but also nationally, and to that national conversation. So we're keeping that dialogue open, and we're supporting them with efforts where we can, through that Western Sydney lens. I think just centering First Nations is part of any approach to anti-racism, and that's what we need to do in any anti-racist approach. So it's not so much me or my thinking, it's more the theory, the evidence, everything suggests that you centre First Nations. For me, at the working group, there's something magical that happens when Uncle Greg and Auntie Carol come along, and that we are there and privileged to listen to them, their guidance, their advice, how to tread in this space, what to do. We often say things as, you know, citizens or people who might be migrants or have different cultural identities, and they don't necessarily resonate in the same way with First Nations communities, because it's like, but we don't have that. Like, we've got country, we don't have homelands in the same way. Or, you know, there's things that I hear discussion happening which might be different for First Nations, and we need to recognise that. There needs to be recognition that there's no, I guess, there's not one homogenous culture or experience with people and racism. So, I mean, centering First Nations is 101. It's not something I'm particularly recommending. It's just, that's the state of play if you want to have any anti-racist approach. So essentially it's not about me or what I say, it's just 101. If you want to take an anti-racist approach, you centre First Nations. You focus on First Nations first.
Talk about that a bit.
So in terms of developing a shared understanding and shared terminology around race and anti-racism, one of the first things a working party did was organise training through a consultancy called Hue, Colour the Conversation, and it's led by people of colour, women of colour and trans people of colour, to deliver anti-racism and kind of awareness training, rather than having, people without colour delivering training around these issues. So they started that, and we engaged them to deliver training sessions focused on race and racism and allyship. So 2 sessions which we wanted all levels of this organisation to be involved in. So we had board members, we had staff from CEO to, officers within the staff team. And we also had Uncle Greg and Auntie Carol. That was an optional thing for them. There's never an expectation of Aboriginal elders requiring training or stuff, but they both expressed an interest in attending. So that training enabled us to develop, because everybody is at a different stage of their anti-racism journey. So we all, as with wider society, have different understandings of what these terms mean. So we were able to look at and develop a shared understanding of terms such as race or culture or ethnicity, and all of that to see what that means to us collectively, rather than from our own varied understandings.
Great.
From an organisational sense, where I'd like to go with the work that we're doing, I obviously want to continue with the reflective piece, but I also see us working more towards influencing the practice of agencies and sharing our insights so that it hopefully becomes a resource and a tool that other agencies working with people can use. I would like to see us work more closely on this issue with community organisations, to look at how we can actually make an impact in terms of racism and anti-racism in Western Sydney, in a way that's meaningful to our community. And our communities, it might be different in different locations, right? And where I would like to go more at an individual professional level is probably just to continue this reflection, continue to be guided by Uncle Greg and Auntie Carol in their teachings, and just some of the things that they say. An example that Auntie Carol used once at a meeting of I was at that training on allyship, and she just said, when kids are getting teased at school because they're migrants or something like that, I just tell our kids, just stand next to them. You don't have to say anything, you don't have to do anything, just stand with them. So that's solidarity and allyship, and that simple story just spoke to me so loudly of what allyship actually is. You don't have to come in, you don't have to say anything, you don't have to take over, you don't have to whatever, just be side by side with people. And it was just simple but meant so much. So just the guidance from Auntie Carol and Uncle Greg is what I feel I'm fortunate and I want to continue to explore and learn from.